But our guest this evening is one of the great journalists, I think, Mr. William Plaff, who we're absolutely delighted to have with us. Mr. Plaff is a graduate of Notre Dame. He worked as an executive with Radio Free Europe. He was an editor of the Commonweal magazine, and then at that wonderful place, the Heritage Institute with Mr. Kahn in the early days, and later worked with the Heritage's overseas extension in Paris. Now, as all of you know, he's a commentator with the International Herald Tribune and an author. His books have been extraordinarily well received. His book, Barbarian Sentiments, How the American Century Ends, was a finalist for the U.S. National Book Award, and its French translation received the City of Geneva's Rousseau Prize as the best book in French during 1989. His most recent book is The Wrath of Nations, Civilization and the Furies of Nationalism, which is a treatment of nationalism's origins and their implications. Tonight we're going to discuss America's role in the world, and nearly all of you have, if you haven't read his books, many of you I know have read his articles in the distinguished journals of the United States in which he's published, Foreign Affairs and others, and an awful lot of you I know have read his columns as they've appeared in The Sun, one just this past week. So we're delighted to be able to present to you this evening Mr. William Plaff, who will speak to America's role in the world. Mr. Plaff.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrd. For the sake of the good reputation of the American Heritage Foundation, I should perhaps say that the organization I was connected with was the Hudson Institute. It's very pleasant to find myself in Baltimore because this is the first time I've been here. I've been to the north of you and to the south of you. But Baltimore, of course, is a mythic city in American history. And also, for anyone who writes for newspapers, it is a city with the formidable tradition of the Sun newspapers and the bulking presence of H.L. Mencken. I'm grateful also to the Council on Foreign Relations for having invited me, a letter that came out of the blue last summer, although I think that David Ness, whom I've not yet met, may have had something to do with this. You've asked me to talk about America's role in the contemporary world. It's a question which poses the old dualisms in the American mind as it regards the world around us. A dualism between the instinct for withdrawal from what traditionally we Americans have seen as a dangerous, immoral, corrupt or corrupting world out there, which was expressed in our policies in isolationism in the past. Dualism paired, on the other hand, with the sense of mission to reform that very world, since, after all, we are the city on the hill. We are the new political dispensation, as virtually every modern American, every major American leader from from Thomas Jefferson to William Jefferson Clinton, has proclaimed us to be, too often perhaps without really analyzing of what they spoke. Let me begin with a comment on the past expression of that dualism, America's isolationism in the 1920s and 1930s, which was a characteristic response, but also a rational response to a particular situation, if not necessarily the best response. It saw American national interest as apart from that of the Europe from whence we had come. It concluded that the United States should not implicate itself in European affairs more than seemed strictly necessary. The United States, however, at the same time, was not at all isolationist in its view of Asia, where we were a colonial power in the Philippines, for many years had had a military and naval presence in China, on the China coast, and were anxious about Japanese imperialism. The pre-war isolationism was appropriate for the United States in the 1930s. The country's historical perception of its proper relationship to the European great powers had always been to keep them at arm's length, to bar them from this side of the Atlantic, to avoid involvement in their quarrels, which we were accustomed to see as self-interested and sterile and a source of danger for us. Intervention in the First World War was an exceptional event for us, and nothing in what happened immediately afterwards in Europe contradicted what we had previously been accustomed to think about Europe and the Europeans. Isolationism at that time was also a feasible policy. While levels of transatlantic trade then were not really very different from what they are now, in fact, the levels were roughly the same, our political and strategic isolation was reinforced by the material and strategic circumstances of the time. We were, or we could make ourselves self-sufficient in virtually every commodity. The country fed itself. Its economy depended on the huge domestic market. Popular demand for industrial goods was enormous, even if after 1929, the Great Depression choked off popular buying power. The country was secure at that time, protected by oceans and by a navy that had both Atlantic and Pacific fleets. A fleet as large as Britain's, larger than any other. There was no transatlantic air threat. The Pacific Ocean was a total barrier. Even if all of Europe or all of Asia came under hostile hegemonies, they would threaten the United States only, it seemed, in exotic scenarios. Franklin Roosevelt found it impossible to convince the country that we had a sufficient interest in either European or Asian developments to justify direct military intervention in the Second World War when it broke out. Although we were at the same time conducting a policy in Asia meant to check Japan's expansion without acknowledging to ourselves that this was almost certainly eventually to bring war with Japan. The Japanese and then the Germans were the ones who forced the United States into the Second World War. And it's still an interesting question as to whether the United States would have gone to war with Germany after Pearl Harbor had Hitler not decided to declare war on the United States. Because the country's fury in 1940, in December 1940, was fixed on the Japanese, not the Germans. Today, in contrast, we are strategically vulnerable. American business is deeply implicated in the international economy. Recent events in Asia could yet damage America's well-being. The globalization of the American economy is perhaps less extensive than commonly thought, or as commonly propagandized in the debate over trade and globalization. But American industry and finance have given enormously important hostages to the international economy, to international trade and international investment. 5 decades of what was to have been the American century have also created a large American military deployment abroad, American assumptions of responsibility in the Middle East, East Asia, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, as well as in Europe. Americans may be, from time to time, uneasy about those engagements, or about some of them, but they exist, and they could not be terminated without much difficulty and the expenditure of much political credit. The national consciousness has been globalized, so to speak, in the television and the internet and tourism give people the impression of living globally, even when their actual knowledge of the rest of the world is superficial or dated or simply wrong, as, alas, is often the case. So the country is globally involved without fully grasping that it no longer possesses the autonomy it formerly did. It's now a smaller industrial and trading entity than the European Union. It's not as dependent on exports as most European economies or the North Asian economies. But the Europeans' dependence is chiefly upon exports to one another in what is the principal world market for sophisticated industrial goods. We, on the other hand, are a vast market for Japanese and other East Asian exports, but we are also heavily dependent on Japanese finance and investment, and to a significant degree dependent upon our own exports chiefly of agricultural and raw materials to the Far East. We are the most important economic power on the so-called Pacific Rim, but the other countries bordering the Pacific, with the exception of Japan, are, as we've seen in recent days, rather less reliable partners than we thought. They are also less important industrially than we have been inclined to tell ourselves they are. For example, China's GNP or GDP is much debated and varies dramatically according to whether you use the calculating device of purchasing power parities in making your calculations. But purchasing power parities are really not very good for international comparisons. And if you use the more relevant comparisons that are used, say, by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, it would seem that the Chinese economy is actually smaller, considerably smaller, than that of Britain, although the British economy is obviously more sophisticated and functions in a free society. South Korea's economy before the crash was a quarter the size of Italy's. Indonesia's GDP is roughly equivalent to that of Denmark, except that Indonesia has a population of 200 million and Denmark a population of 5 million. Is isolation feasible for America in this world? Ronald Steele, who's, in my opinion, a very distinguished and a very perceptive critic of American policies, wrote a book a year or so ago calling on the United States to take up a policy of what he called splendid isolation, emulating Britain at the time when, as he says, Britain was not unchallenged, but was unquestionably the first among only potential equals. He says quite rightly that the United States today, like Britain in the 19th century, has no serious enemies and requires no allies. strictly speaking. The obsession we have with rogue states may be seen as, in significant respects, an attempt to invent or to exaggerate enemies to make them big enough to justify our huge investment in military security and striking power, and also because of the psychological need for enemies, because if you have enemies, you can defeat them. But if you do not have enemies, then you are deprived in important way of a sense of what your national mission really is. However, whatever the argument that may be made for an American withdrawal or a significant drawing back from the international scene, I don't myself see Americans today, or in the foreseeable future, capable of taking so detached a view of world affairs as to carry out a policy of retrenchment and withdrawal. Nor do I think that such a stance would be an entirely realistic proposition when the international connections of the country are as complex and as dense as they are today. There is a drumbeat of popular opinion and popular rhetoric in the country which says America is number one, the envy of the world, the happiest of lands, and which claims world leadership, or even, to take some recent books, benevolent hegemony in the world as a matter of national right. But there is at the same time, as we all know, a considerable reluctance among Americans to undertake the military risks and costs associated with this claim to international leadership. There's a political sensitivity in Washington towards risk, which is much larger even among the political class and, curiously, among the military, than the evidence of public opinion itself would seem to justify. As you probably know, the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations every 4-year polls American views on international affairs. And in recent years, these polls have consistently shown people saying that the United States should take a leading role in world affairs, both the general poll of public opinion and a poll they also run of so-called leaders who are professionally involved in making policy. They show, in fact, that while the nation's leadership has a more ambitious role about the world role that the United States should undertake, it also has more doubts about its feasibility than the ordinary citizens polled by the Chicago Council. The public, on the other hand, says that it wants world leadership, but is reluctant to supply the material means for it, to be taxed for it, is wary about its human costs, believes other countries aren't carrying their share of responsibility. It can't really be said that the public is isolationist, but on the other hand, this internationalism is rather more theory than practice. And it also rests on a good deal of ignorance about what is going on abroad. There was a recent poll, for example, which showed that 67% of Americans favor NATO expansion. But it also showed that less than 10% can name even one of the countries that are supposed to be brought into an expanded NATO. In this respect, I would have to say parenthetically that there has been a dereliction of duty by the press. The press purports to be a profession. It once considered itself a trade, but it now calls itself a profession. But professions, by definition, act to autonomous standards which respond to the public and the national interests. In principle, at least, professionals are supposed to refuse to subordinate their standards to purely commercial considerations. And this has not been true for most of the American press or those who control it, and certainly not for American broadcasting in recent years, both of which, as recently or as 40 or even 30 years ago, did practice very high standards in covering world affairs, even though the audience then was a limited one. There was a professional assumption that the press had a serious obligation to reportage and analysis, even if this had no commercial return. There was an assumption that we were supposed to tell people what they should know, even if they didn't want to hear it. But obviously this is not the case today for most of the media, with honorable exceptions. But then one can ask, what end would be served even if the government and public were better informed? What is it that we're trying to accomplish in the world? The public and its leaders lay claim to a continuing role of global leadership, but there is no real consensus in the country on how or where we are supposed to lead the world, now that there is no longer a Cold War. Since 1989, there have been a number of attempts to formulate a new rationale for American foreign policy, or attempts to provide new interpretive paradigms, as they say, of international society to serve as rationales for policy. The Bush administration, you'll recall, tried to articulate a general policy formulation in the blush of its success in the Gulf War, the so-called New World Order, which would be established under American leadership. I think it not unfair to say that the intellectual content of this was not great, but the Western alliance was supposed to expand and function with UN approval when convenient, at least, to deal with international problems. The United States would guide. The Japanese, the Arab oil countries, and Europe seemed to be expected to put up most of the money. This evoked little enthusiasm from them, but also not a great deal of enthusiasm in the United States, and has since faded away, except in the demonology of the new American right, which has seen in it still another manifestation of hated Eastern Seaboard internationalism. The successor to the New World Order was multilateralism, an idea adopted by the first Clinton administration, scarcely distinguishable from its predecessor except by its larger emphasis on cooperation through the United Nations. The misadventures of the UN in Somalia and the former Yugoslavia subsequently caused Washington to turn to NATO as the agent of political military intervention, which was undertaken in Bosnia by the administration after many months under much pressure from abroad and with great trepidation. The theoretical framework of Clinton administration policy generally, I would say, is a desiccated version of that Wilsonianism, which has been the single most important influence on 20th century American foreign policy, which provides us with a vocabulary, even though we no longer quite understand or think seriously about what the words mean. This is true for this administration, but in essential respects, it's true for the neoconservative opposition as well. There's a kind of cross-party agreement that democracy and free markets will advance hand in hand towards a new international order, which will be essentially American in inspiration and character, ruled by market economics, democracy, and respect for human rights. foreign policy is considered simply a matter of helping this natural evolution along, clearing away the obstacles to a foreordained historical progress. As Tony Lake, the former NSC advisor in the first Clinton administration, put it, the policy of the United States should be to struggle against tribalists, terrorists, organized criminals, coup plotters, rogue states, and all those who would return newly free states to the intolerant ways of the past. Please note that intolerance is of the past, while the future is bright with promise. Historical tragedy has no place in the American liberal imagination, nor, in fairness, one must add, does it have much place in the conceptions of what popularly, if erroneously, is called American conservatism. This kind of reassuring talk of sunny futures has relatively little serious effect on what is being done in policy today. The actual policy of this administration, it seems to me, is essentially driven by corporate interest in deregulation and trade, and the interests of domestic political lobbies. Now, this is defensible. Historically, as Walter Mead Russell has pointed out, historically America has had a foreign policy, and it's been a foreign policy of guaranteeing access to markets for American manufacturers and guaranteeing freedom of the seas. And it goes back to the time of the Barbary pirates. And in a certain respect, that is what the economic side of American foreign policy continues to do today. And the role of domestic lobbies on policy surely is perfectly defensible in terms of democratic responsiveness. But the combination of this kind of policy of simple reaction to domestic political forces has not been entirely successful, as we may see, for example, in its having made the United States vulnerable to such adventurers as Iraq's Saddam Hussein. The Iraqi president has just successfully whipsawed the Clinton administration so as to divide it from our allies, to lighten UN sanctions on Iraq, revealed the political limits on US military power, and weaken the American position in the Middle East generally, while strengthening that of Russia, which for some years has been absent from the Middle East but is now back. Dual containment, the American policy of blocking both Iraq's and Iran's influence in the Near East, is failing. Sanctions on both countries are slipping. We do not carry global opinion in this. There was, parenthetically, at one point in the Iraq crisis, when no one else in the Security Council would support the United States, and Russia and France were mediating, trying to get an easier solution with Iraq, and none of the Arabs would support us. There was, I remember, one column, but there was also an official statement which said, we must teach Russia and France to respect international public opinion. So international public opinion, c'est moi. But Washington's claim today to be the disinterested ally of the moderate Arab states and an impartial arbiter in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not really sustainable now. The Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu has interpreted its electoral mandate perfectly properly, as having authorizing the effective abandonment of the so-called peace process. And the United States has acquiesced because of congressional pressures on the administration, and to some extent presidential and future presidential electoral considerations. But the result is that Washington simply is no longer accepted as an impartial interlocutor in the Middle East. Washington's connection with Saudi Arabia, which has been its principal regional ally, and with certain of the fragile and oil-rich Emirates, couldn't produce action in support of the U.S. Vis-a-vis Saddam Hussein. I think possibly even in Saudi Arabia, it is beginning to be grasped that the American role in Saudi Arabia threatens to become that same suffocating embrace that proved fatal to another conservative American client, the Shah of Iran. Now, the Clinton administration bears responsibility for this, but the diligently self-destructive parochialism and nationalism of Congress has made by far the larger contribution to the situation, and one must say the American public gets the Congress that it elects. Last month, before it adjourned, Congress deliberately rejected previously agreed legislation to pay a part of long overdue American UN dues and to offer a new credit line to the International Monetary Fund, which God knows needs it these days. And this was done by Congress for purely spiteful domestic political motives. The greatest student of American democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote 150 years ago that, quote, almost all the defects inherent in democratic institutions are brought to light in the conduct of foreign affairs. And this is a judgment which the last 50 years of relatively successful policy and a united American foreign policy in a context of great world crisis, a judgment which has tended to become obscured, but which the last 10 years, and certainly the last 2 years, have entirely validated. Since the collapse of communism, Cold War unity has faded in American policymaking and among the Western allies. The United States has lapsed into a perfectly proper preoccupation with domestic affairs. It has fallen into the state of consciousness or of mind or of attitude appropriate to isolationism, to a policy of isolationism. And yet, as I have said, isolationism is not today as such a defensible policy, in my view. But one cannot practice an isolationist domestic politics and proclaim globalist ambitions at the same time. We've got to do one or the other. There's a fundamental contradiction between what the United States says it wants to do in leading the world and what it proves able or willing to do in support of that claim. We don't seem to be willing to pay for our policies. We don't seem to be willing to make any sacrifices for them. And the policies themselves often leave much to be desired in seriousness. Let me summarize then the circumstances in which we find ourselves. The United States has very important and very extensive international economic, political, military, and cultural engagements. The country is fundamentally secure from external threat. We can write scenarios of insecurity, but these are usually fairly exotic, of the rogue nation, madman with an atom bomb variety. Our allies of the Cold War decades are also now our commercial rivals. They're rich and able to look after their own security, to concern themselves with the stability of the regions of concern to them, although they have been reluctant to do so for complex reasons. One of them, the reluctance of the United States to see them do so. The poorer societies in of the non-Western world experience anarchic forces and profound social discontents, in part as a consequence of globalization. And these tend to be exported towards the rich countries in many ways, not least by immigration. But no one seems to have a coherent idea of what to do about this, other than to try to contain the consequences of what in considerable measure is a result of ours and the West's in general past cultural and economic interventions in these regions. The American public, meanwhile, thinks well of internationalism as a general proposition, but tends to oppose specific foreign military and political interventions when these seem to involve any risks. It's inclined to say that the United States has enough trouble to deal with at home, and in such circumstances, what then can we say about American internationalism? On the evidence of recent years, we have responded to this problem with a tendency to develop a unilateralist policy in the guise of internationalism, in which we're no longer concerned with traditional alliance relationships, but are driven for economic reasons to search for a dominant trade and corporate position in world markets, and at the same time to secure the country with a global apparatus of military intervention, financed at levels of expenditure surpassing those of all the rest of the world put together, whose purpose, if you read some of the rationales for it, is quote unquote ascendance, the sort of language we used to use at Hudson Institute, ascendance over not only prospective enemies, but implicitly, and even in some documents explicitly, over America's former allies as well, who have been re-identified in Pentagon parlance as non-traditional opponents. Both elements in this approach to international society, the economic and the military, are driven by internal dynamics, and also by the search for perfect security, which is a grail we shall not achieve. But I think the implications of all of this have yet to be fully brought out in the open. I say that because internationalism is not so much the choice but the condition of American policy today and in the future, even though the country has turned in on itself. The conceptions of America's role in the world that dominate the debate tend to be self-indulgent and sentimental, or they are influenced by a certain amount of misinformation or fantasy that veers into the conspiratorial or paranoid, as is true for a segment of the well, even of the mainstream right, if you consider the level of hostility and fear that seems to exist in the country of the poor, impoverished, and toothless United Nations. There really is no alternative to internationalism. We are the major power. We have a future as a great power, but not, I think, as a hegemonic power. The question is, how will we conduct ourselves as a great power? Will we be intelligent or foolish internationalists, self-aggrandizing in pursuit of unilateral advantage, or constructive in our relations with others? The actual possibilities before the United States include a fairly aggressive unilateralist pursuit of national advantage, animated by an essentially isolationist national sensibility. It is significant that the new generation of weapons, which are in the works, or at least in the intellectual pipeline, although bringing them to material realization has run into certain practical obstacles, but they are of space-based, perfect defensive systems that will keep evil away from the United States and allow the United States to strike with robot weapons and laser rays at enemies everywhere in the world as a result of orbiting perfect intelligence systems. Now, realizable or not, the subtext to this kind of global interventionism, all conducted from a basement in Northern Virginia, tells us something about the state of mind of the government, but also the government reflects the state of mind of the public. The risk we run, in my view, is less isolationism in policy, but the isolated mind, which possesses only a very narrow interest, a narrow understanding of the national interest, and therefore risks provoking not only political isolation, but an ultimate insecurity. Because security can't be achieved by the preemptive suppression of every possible threat, as Saddam Hussein has demonstrated to us. It can't be provided by the search for even tacit domination over everyone else, the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, because the eventual result of such an effort will simply be to generate threat and revolt against us. Others, too, have an interest in a balance of power. I say that we have a national interest in the autonomy of others on the world stage, in a pluralism of power, a pluralism of creative reflection and interchange. It's not in our national interest to stand alone. That is the mortal temptation inherent in hegemonic military power. Our interest lies in defending the principle of peaceful, negotiated, or adjudicated settlement of the conflicts that inevitably arise among societies, and in discouraging, if not deterring, according to circumstances, the resort to force in international affairs. The failure to do that was obviously the original mistake of the Western powers in the former Yugoslavia. Our search for rogues as enemies, or for a new grand scheme of things to explain the post-Cold War era, for some new formulation of internationalism or some overreaching paradigm, seems to suggest that we expect eventually to arrive at some grand resolution of history. And this, I think, is our hangover from the ideological thinking that has dominated Western political society since the late 19th century, or even from the French Revolution. Politics has been disciplined to various conceptions of a final solution. The final solution, in the form that it took in Europe in the 40s, was a macabre realization of this expectation, but it functions equally well in progressive politics as it did in Marxist politics. I think that with the turn of the century, the era of that kind of thinking is something we should and perhaps will put behind us. We in America are perhaps the last to realize that the age of ideology has ended. Now, I don't mean to argue that history is meaningless or is a waste, or that we're not obliged to try to improve society or improve the relations of peoples. So far as our own country is concerned, I agree with those who say that the national priority should be to try to reconcile our domestic conflicts of ethnic, race, sex, economic, and social class and advantage. Internationally, I would re-emphasize a point made in classical political philosophy, that political action, according to Aristotle, is a matter of doing justice, which is to give others their due, which acknowledges that others are due something, that they have rights and legitimate claims. This is a different outlook from the one which postulates the need for an aggressive pursuit of national advantage, or proposes a supposedly progressive vision of the future in which we are all supposed to fit ourselves and fit others as well. One of the late University of Chicago political philosopher Hans Morgenthau's warnings to the United States in 1951 at the peak of the Cold War was that it must remember, and I quote, that no nation's power is without limits, and hence that its policies must respect the power and interests of others. Our national interest is served by cooperating with those who share our values quite as much as by containing the influence of those who oppose them, of whom there will always be many, notwithstanding the implicit millenarianism of American policy speculation. It's worth remembering that the most brilliant success in the history of American internationalist foreign policy was containment. And the essence of containment was to be firm but patient with the great problem history had thrown up to us, so as to allow Soviet communism to disintegrate of its own contradictions. George Kennan's own words in his X article, The Foundation of the Containment Policy in 1947, were that the Soviet system had, quote, within it the seeds of its own decay. And so it did. Kennan also said that the confrontation of the Soviet Russia was a test of the overall worth of the United States as a nation among nations. And he expressed, he said, a certain gratitude to a providence which, by providing the American people with this implacable challenge, has made their entire security as a nation dependent on their pulling themselves together and accepting the responsibilities of moral and political leadership that history plainly intended them to bear. That was an expression of confidence, but it also implied a question. Would we possess the moral qualities and political intelligence required? The answer to the question, as it was posed in 1947, proved to be positive on the whole, for which we may be grateful. But that answer inevitably is always a provisional answer. History has brought us from then to now, and now the question is asked again to this generation. The fact is that history is not open to settlement. History is a process that reflects the dense complexity of life itself, which is never settled. The exercise of national moral and political responsibility is never a settled matter, as it is not in life itself. Thank you.
Well, we thank you for that model of political discussion, an exercise in raising the level of debate and analysis. We're in your debt for just a marvelous overview and a very thoughtful one indeed. The floor is now open for questions. The question is, what did you mean by backing countries?
Well, I think that what the question is referring to what is a permanent problem. It's the problem of competitive international relations, of competitive economic relations. In our eyes, the Japanese mistreat Kodak. In Japanese eyes, why Fuji is an innocent victim of predatory American forces. And this kind of thing, this is what adjudication, what negotiation is for, and no one is ever satisfied, or is rarely satisfied with the way things come out. But you know, a friend of mine used to say, there are good problems and bad problems. And these are good problems because they can be worked out. They're the problems that we have in the negotiations of our ordinary lives or in the negotiations of business inside the United States itself.
How would you explain the high level of troops in Germany at this time, American troops?
Well, I think there are a number of factors that have gone into it. I don't think it's a matter of a single policy decision. First of all, there is simply bureaucratic inertia. NATO is now a bureaucracy. It is a bureaucracy with thousands of people dependent upon jobs and careers being made in NATO. Now, one might reasonably have said in 1989 or 1990, let's disband NATO. But that's like saying let's disband the Pentagon. Even if it were theoretically justified, and you can make a much better case for NATO than for the Pentagon, but even if it were theoretically justified, institutions are very, very difficult even to reduce, much less to kill off. Secondly, the United States sees NATO as the vehicle of American presence in Europe and as the justification for an active American role in the affairs of the European community and in European affairs. Dick Holbrooke said a couple of years ago that the United States is a European power. Now, I know some Europeans that were outraged by that. You know, what do you mean the United States is a European power? But I know what Holbrooke meant. And it is true, we have been a European power since 1945. And we've liked being a European power. Again, bureaucracies have liked it. Bureaucracies like to expand. Bureaucracies like to have power. But also, the United States generally has enjoyed the position of having this huge military instrument basically at its disposal in the center of Europe to do with as it pleased. So while we complain about the costs and talk about various reforms in NATO, basically we've wanted to keep those troops there. And if we start, and the argument would no doubt be a domino theory argument. If you start bringing some troops out, obviously many have come out, but if you were to continue to reduce, why then you would reach the point in which the whole thing would begin to come apart. Thirdly, most of the Europeans have wanted the United States to stay there, not because, well, obviously, if you've got somebody who puts a vast army in your backyard, why, if you think that one day you're going to have another threat like that of the Cold War, well, you say, fine, leave them there. Nobody really thinks that in Europe anymore. But it's very convenient for, say, the Danes or the Dutch to have the United States in Europe because it is a counterbalance to their neighbor and big powers. I mean, the Dutch don't particularly like the Germans from whom they have suffered historically. The Danes don't particularly like the Germans. They don't particularly like the French from whom they suffered in an earlier, in the last century. So small powers always make alliances with remote great powers the more remote the better, because then that keeps them from, from turning into problems themselves. But what I'm saying, I mean, one could go on with this, but what I'm saying is that there is there are interlocking interests here to keep troops in NATO, and if it obviously cannot go on forever, and the way public opinion would appear to be going in the United States, in congressional opinion, and well, I read something the other day, a German parliamentarian said, well, through the Cold War, parliamentary groups have gone back and forth visiting the two sides of the Atlantic. And he said, I don't know how many, well, 150 members of the German parliament, let's say, were in Washington during the course of the year. One American senator was in Germany in the course of the year. And of the European parliamentarians who went to Washington, nobody was at home. They called around, and couldn't we drop in on Senator so-and-so's office or visit the House of Representatives? Thanks very much. Gee, we would love to do it, but the senator's busy, the congressman has got to go home this weekend. So you see, if you, this is this isolationist trend in its practical aspects, and if that goes on, then we are going to get a wind down of NATO, but it will be resisted by the administration, any administration, not just this administration. The administration will resist turning it down, but I think that Congress won't sustain it. I mean, I'll look at the United Nations, where the United Nations has to bargain with Senator Helms, not with the Secretary of State. And that's not a situation that can go on.
Our hegemonic grasp does not extend to time, and we've exhausted it. And in deference to it, we're going to have to end our session. And what has been a wonderful evening with William Pfaff, enlightening and pleasant. I must say that I apologize to the Hudson Institute. I've attended several of those sessions, which with the late Herman Kahn, yes, and it was both educational and entertaining. This evening, too, has been that. So we indeed thank you for a marvelous time.